Joining me here in London is Colin Bloom, who is a former advisor to the government on faith-based extremism, also well known for his book, for the report, the Bloom Report. He authored it. It is based on far-right faith-based extremism. Thank you so much, Colin, for joining us here on India Today. Beginning with the Israel-Palestine war that we're seeing, the Hamas attack, how do you see the UK administration look at the attack and the response of Israel?
Well, I think, first of all, we have to recognise that what has happened has been an absolute abomination, and it has shocked the whole world. What Hamas have done, and I think it's really important to say at the very beginning that not all Palestinians are Hamas, and clearly not everyone who's supporting Hamas are even Palestinians, and we've seen that here on the streets of London and on the streets of many other Western capitals. So what has happened has been, extremely tragic and very violent, and with so many people being killed and injured and captured, and there is great suffering on both sides, and I think that needs to be acknowledged. So there's something that is happening with Hamas. There's something about the timing of why they did it, when they did it, which I think we need to have some sober reflection to understand exactly why they did it at this time. And I think that clearly a lot of people are very, very anxious. Primarily, it is the British Jewish community, and we have many Jews who live here in London who are incredibly anxious at the moment. I mean, this is a community that were already feeling very victimised and under enormous pressure and enormous threat, now even more so. And they are probably the only community that we have in the UK that are now living with a packed bag near their door so that they can leave in a hurry. And we haven't seen anything like this in Europe since the Second World War, when so many of them were massacred in the Holocaust. So you can understand why I think people are feeling extremely anxious, very scared, and perhaps why some responses are the way that they are. I feel that the British government have taken an incredibly strong stand in supporting Israel's right to defend itself, and for calling for emergency aid to get into Gaza, into the Gaza Strip, so that the people who are there are given as much relief as possible.
A lot of them are talking about proportionality, the response to Hamas attack, and how many civilians need to die for an appropriate response to the terror attack. One. Secondly, you spoke about Jews here feeling insecure. What are the kind of reports, or what do you hear of the Jews over here, given that it's not just in London, but we're seeing incidents and reports of violence against the Jewish community in various parts of the world, and that doesn't certainly serve the purpose of the Palestinian cause.
No, you're right. Let's take that second part first. It doesn't serve the cause of the Palestinians when I think the response has been so clearly violent and aggressive towards Jewish communities, whether it's here or in New York or in Paris or anywhere else. And I think I have a lot of sympathy with many Jews, and many that I've spoken to, who say that they are fearful for their livelihoods, they're fearful for their well-being, fearful for their families. And there are very many Jewish families who have been affected in Israel by what has happened. So many people have been killed and have been taken hostage. So I can understand why they're feeling just so anxious, and with real pathos in their voice. To take the first part of your question about proportionality, well, let me just say, I think there is a double standard that is often applied to Israel in many ways. I don't think it's I don't think that it is always as clear cut. If what had happened to Israel just a few weeks ago had happened to America, so if, for example, take a crazy situation where the Mexicans had come across the border in paragliders and tunneled their way into Texas and had murdered and massacred and butchered Americans, do you think we would have been worried about a proportional response? America would have been carpet bombing Mexico
We saw that after 9/11
Exactly.
too.
If the French had done this to the UK, if they had come across the Channel into England and had done to the English, if the French had done to the English what Hamas had done to Israelis, we would be carpet bombing France.
But shouldn't there be lessons learned, Colin, for respect to civilian life? Like, there has to be some tactical attack and ensuring minimal civilian death. I ask this is because we see the international community come together on humanitarian pause for humanitarian aid, not so much coming from the UK as much as it's coming from everywhere else, including the United States of America. Maybe they feel the pressure of West Asia, that's the Middle East.
Well, no, I was answering your question on proportionality.
Yes,
My point was that, you know, if in some crazy scenario that, you know, Sri Lanka had come into southern India and done that, you know, do you think there'd be a Sri Lanka left?
We had a Pakistan, but we had a Pakistan. And they did it 26/11, but we did not carpet bomb Pakistan.
Yeah.
And we've had this problem of terrorism coming from Pakistan for a very long time. But the respect to human lives and civilian lives, especially between India and Pakistan, for all the wrongs in the history of partition, so on and so forth, Colin, at least that certainly has stood the test of time.
Yeah. So I am not suggesting for a second that there is anything to be taken lightly about these civilian casualties and civilian deaths. But in answering the question of proportionality, I do think sometimes we have a double standard when it comes to Israel, and I kind of do feel quite sorry for Israel that they are held to this double standard. However, I do recognise that they are showing more restraint than the British would, and they are showing more restraint than the Americans would if we were in their position. That's the point I'm making. As far as making sure that innocent lives in Gaza are protected as much as possible, then yes, we must all strive for that. And I think the British government are calling for that. I don't speak for the British government. I know that's what they're calling for. Both the current government and the opposition are calling for the same. And most Western countries are calling for restraint and for, you know, a period so that those who are caught in the Gaza Strip are given humanitarian aid. There has to be questions asked, though, about why Hamas are using humans, and, you know, innocent people as human shields to protect their installations. You know, that is pretty inexcusable. And whilst I have every sympathy for a two-state solution, they are not helping their cause. Hamas are not helping the cause of the Palestinians by deliberately putting innocent people in the way of, in the way of harm. And I think there is some serious questions that need to be asked. I would say I'm hopeful that the work that the Qataris are doing, that the Qatari government are acting as intermediaries, as interlocutors to try and de-escalate the situation. I hope they're successful, because, you know, they will have more chance of achieving this than, say, we will be in the UK or India will. India could do something. You know, India could act as an honest broker in this. I know they've come out, the Indian government have come out very strongly in favour of supporting Israel, but you know, you're the 5th biggest economy in the world now. You know, you're 1.35 billion people. You're a powerhouse.
And you have good ties with both sides.
And you have good ties with both sides. And I think India could perhaps engage in trying to bring about peace. You might have more success than the Brits. You might have more success than the Americans. But I do hope that the work that the Qataris are doing is successful. Of course I do. We want peace.
Zooming out a little into the region, how do you see there was a process that was underway, normalization of ties with Israel, establishing diplomatic ties between Israel and some of the Arab nations? Where do you see that head? Because I see everybody, whether it's a Shia country or a Sunni country, come under one umbrella of the Palestinian cause now.
I fear that things will not go back to where they were. I mean, at least for a period of time in recent years, we've had relative peace, where you've had the normalization of relations between Israel and Saudi Arabia, Israel and the United Arab Emirates, Israel and, you know, Qatar and Bahrain and other nations. The Abraham Accords, I think, was a golden opportunity. Donald Trump gets a lot of criticism, and a lot of people have been, you know, perhaps rightly, extremely critical of him as president. But one of the things that he did do, which was, I think, a standout moment in international relations, was the Abraham Accords. Now, that doesn't suit some of the enemies of Israel. It certainly was a good thing. Now, whether or not it's possible to go back to that, I very much doubt, but it's worth trying. We will not get criticised for trying to bring back peace to the region. We will get criticised if we just give up and walk away.
In terms of Gaza, the fact that there's very little aid that's going into Gaza, electricity, water, all of it cut off. What's your advice to how the UK administration has handled the crisis, and particularly the hostage crisis? Would you have advised the government in a particular manner on handling the hostage crisis? If you could address that first, and then we could go to the humanitarian aid.
Well, no, I think the hostage issue, I think, was and it remains still an issue. The gateway between Egypt and the Gaza Strip has now been opened. Just in the last hour since we've been talking, it's been opened, and some hostages have been released. Only about 100. I mean, there is a lot more to do, but it's a good start, and we hope and pray that more will get through. But yes, aid does need to come in through Egypt. Of course, from Israel's perspective, they want to make sure that aid is not going to end up in the hands of terrorists like Hamas. We need to be honest. Hamas are a terrorist organisation who have had form. They have history of taking materials that were meant for humanitarian use and using them to attack Israel. So I can understand why Israel are very, very cautious about this, but some hostages have been released, some aid has coming in. Of course, we want to see more aid go in. It's got to be done in a controlled and careful way. So, look, on the issue of those 200 or so Israeli men and women and children who have been snatched from their country and are currently held hostage, we need them to be released. And Hamas, they're using them as a powerful bargaining tool, but Hamas and people supporting Hamas and people supporting these strikes from Hamas need to understand that that there is a line that has been very severely crossed, and that they will never be welcome back at any kind of diplomatic tables ever again. Not that they ever particularly were.
And finally, when it comes to the crisis itself, we're looking at Israel, Palestine, Gaza, huge difficulties for the people of Gaza, and they have been under blockade for a very long time. But where do you see a solution? Do you see a two-state solution? Will Israel walk back on the territories that they took in the past years? And if not, then where do you see a solution, even if it's recognition of Palestine as a state?
Well, it has been Israeli policy, as it has been British policy and American policy and European policy, for a two-state solution. I hope that will remain. Of course, right now it does feel very difficult to just understand exactly what Israel will do. For many, many years there has been great enmity between the Palestinians and Israel and much of their neighbours. It's interesting that Palestinians have found it very difficult to leave. It's heartbreaking that they have been in the position they've been, both in the West Bank and on the Gaza Strip. But we hope that when the dust has settled and we can get round and the diplomats and the politicians can get round the table, they will come up with a solution. Maybe this situation that's happened, this awful tragedy that has happened, will be so awful that it will force all parties to get round the table and find a solution once and for all.
But Colin, violent protests aside, there are protests that are happening in London. What do you make of those protests? There are so many who are not Palestinians, from the Muslim faith, from various other faiths also, who are coming out in support of a Palestine, a free Palestine. How's the international community looking at it? How are you looking at it? Because it has become sort of a security issue as well as the fact that the world is looking at the Palestine issue yet again after not having looked at or touched upon the Palestine cause for many years. We've seen the Palestinians fight for it for years, but it's not covered and it's back on the front pages in news. So how do you look at these protests?
I mean, first of all, in terms of first principles, we live in the UK, a free country where protest, freedom of speech, freedom of assembly is much cherished. And so I would never want to live in a country where people didn't feel that they could protest and speak their mind. You cross a line when it becomes violent or coercive, or where there is property damage or there are threats which are made. And I think the police have got a very, very difficult job because emotions are so high. I feel very sorry for the Metropolitan Police Commissioner, who is caught between a rock and a hard place. If they go in too hard, then we will have a major disruption and a riot. And if he doesn't go in hard enough, he gets criticised by people, particularly in the government, for not being tough enough. They've got a very difficult balance to get between freedom of assembly, freedom of protest, basic human rights, and I think the behaviour of some that take it too far. Sometimes they're going to get it wrong. But I think in the heat of the moment that we're seeing every day, almost, major protests, I think the police have pretty much got it right. It's not to everybody's liking, and some of my friends will criticise me for this, but I think, we need to make sure that overall we keep that protests are as peaceful as possible. And if throughout the course of these protests, and bearing in mind everything is on CCTV, everything is going to be filmed, if there are people that have broken the law, then the police will have time to go back later, identify who they are, and deal with them appropriately. But you're dealing with like a tinderbox situation. It can erupt in flames at any moment. And I'm not going to criticise our law enforcement agencies here in the United Kingdom, who I think have pretty much doing a good job in very, very difficult circumstances. If I'm critical of anybody, I think I might be critical of our own Home Secretary, who I think has been, in her use of language, saying all of these people are on a hate march. I think was that was unwise, and I would imagine that she has probably been reminded that she is the Home Secretary of the United Kingdom, not to be pouring petrol onto something which is already aflame.
And probably goes against what you just said, the tenets of democracy, where you respect freedom of speech. Thank you so much, Colin Bloom, for joining us here on India Today. That's Colin Bloom, the author of the Bloom Report, speaking exclusively to India Today from here in London.